ConfigMap. So ConfigMap is something very, very important when you wanted to load a set of environment variables to a container, right? So currently in the job also you see like adding four environment variables, like I have to write a lot of lines of code in the Kubernetes, right? Instead of that, is there a single place where I can store all the environment variables and I can use it? We can use a config map, or otherwise, imagine your application is going to have a configuration file. Okay, let's say you have an existing configuration file. You want to convert the complete application configuration file. Okay, and you want that configuration file to be uploaded to the container when the container is getting deployed. That is also possible using the config map. Okay, so let's see both the example. The first example we are going to see, I'm going to give multiple environment variables as a config map, and I'm going to load the environment variables from the config map. That is one example we are going to see. And the next example, we will take example of Redis. We will create a sample Redis configuration file, and that file will be mounted onto the container when the container is coming up. So let's see how these two things are going to work. So the first example we are going to talk about is how to put multiple config environment variables as a config map. So let's do that. So notepad config map dot YAML. The API version for config map is v1, and kind is config map, and metadata. Let me name the config map. Name is, let me call it as example config map. Then let me put the data inside the config map. Let me give multiple options here. So first option, I'm going to do a variable is equal to value mapping. So let's say database, one kind of variable equal to value mapping. Let me give one more, database URL, yes, MySQL :// db.training.com 3306. Okay, these are variable is equal to value mapping. Then the next option I'm going to talk about is a dictionary variable. So let's say keys. So one variable having multiple values in a key value pair mapping. So this one we can use name dot AINING equal to Kubernetes program dot AINING equal to config map. Let's see. Okay. So let me save this config map and let me apply this kubectl apply -f config map.yaml. So once it is added, you should be able to see them under the config maps. You can see the example config map. Inside that, you can see this values. So now let us bring up a pod. In the pod, we will try to bring the container. Okay, so let's see. Oh, sorry, in the pod, we will attach the uh, config map, and we'll see how the environment variables are listed inside the particular pod. So notepad config map pod.yaml API version 1 this pod data as config pod and specs for the pod is containers want to config map pod images. Let me use Nginx for this. Next, NV from so environment variables from config map reference and the name of the config map. So the name of the config map was example config map. So let me save this. Let me try to apply this. CTL. Right. Under map pod.yaml. Oh, sorry, should be capital P. Save it. So now let us get the pod kubectl pods kubectl get pods. So you can see a new pod called ConfigMap pod has been created. So let me get a bash inside the ConfigMap pod. So kubectl exec -it this ConfigMap pod -bash. So we know that the command to print the environment variables is env. So if you run that, you can see that will have some default environment variables like that. Additionally, I will have some additional thing. Like for example, the database which I given the config map pod and the database URL, and also I see the library variable. So this is how you can create a config map, and all the values inside the config map can be loaded as an environment variable inside the container. This is one option. Okay. So the next option we are going to see about here is, okay, imagine you have a huge application configuration file, okay, and you want to pass the complete application configuration file as an environment variable. Let's see how do I do that. So for that, let us create for this example, I'm going to use Redis as my application. Okay. So Redis is a memcache application. That means it basically sits in between your database and the application layer, and it can load the database values in the memory. And when you want to query things in the memory, it will be much faster than querying it from the database. So it can use that. It uses some algorithm to update the data from the database and all those steps. So we'll use that as an example. Okay. So for that, first, let me create a database, Redis configuration file. Okay. So let me create that first. Notepad, Redis -config. Okay. This is going to create the file with .txt extension, but I don't want that. I'll remove it while saving it. So in the configuration file, I'm going to give only two parameters. I don't want to copy paste the complete Redis configuration file, so that we'll be able to test it whether the value is getting reflected. So the two values I'm going to give in the config are max memory is 2 MB. That means what is the maximum memory that Redis can use, and the max max memory policy. Okay, it will be all keys -LRU. So this is something like based on the last used resource, it is going to update that. This is a predefined algorithm inside the Redis. So I'm just going to pass these two values, and let me save this without extension. What is batch? Batch 1, batch 2 training. Save it in the training directory. Batch 2. Yeah. Save it without any extension by putting them within the quotes. I can store it without extension. So using this file, I am going to using this file. Let me create a ConfigMap. QCTL create ConfigMap. Let me call the ConfigMap as Redis from file equal to from Redis config. So once it is done, if you go to the dashboard, if you go to the ConfigMaps, and if you click on the Redis, you can see the values are there with the key Redis-config. So the next thing we are going to do here is we are going to create a pod, especially we are going to use the Redis pod, and from there we will see how the file is getting loaded, how to load the config map as a configuration file inside the container. Let's see that. So the next thing we are going to do here is we are going to create a pod, especially we are going to use the Redis pod, and from there we will see how the file is getting loaded, how to load the config map as a configuration file inside the container. Let's see that. So, Notepad, ConfigMap, Redis.yml. display version, and then the kind is pod, and meta data is Redis. So the name of the pod is Redis, and for spec, containers, and name of the container is, call it as Redis, and image I'm going to use this colon 0.4. I'm going to use this specific Redis image, and the default Redis image will be starting with the default configuration which is available in the etc Redis location. Okay, so I'm going to say, instead of starting the Redis with the default config, I want this Redis to be started with the configuration file, which I'm going to provide it as an input. So I'm going to provide a command for it. The command Redis server, use a configuration file from Redis master / redis.conf. So this is the file I'm going to create using ConfigMap. So we'll see that in the bottom. And then I'm going to pass a environment variable. That is, I want this Redis to be running as a master. So that as an environment variable, name is master, and value is true. This is how you can define whether the running Redis container is a master or not. You can find that in the Redis official image. You see, this is the default location of the Redis config, but I'm going to load it from the in a different location. I'm going to create my own Redis config. And if you see the environment variables, but this version I need to provide this environment variable. I haven't put it there. It's okay. And then ports is container port 6379. Okay. And I'm going to create the volume mounts, so that in the volume mount I will mount the configuration file. So mounts path. I'm going to create one mount path called to store the data, one mount path to store the config. Okay, so the two mount paths I'm going to create, one to store the master data, one to store the config. So it will be /redis -master -data, and name of the mount path, let me call it as data. And another mount path is path this -master. And name of this mount path, let me call it as config. And with the containers, I'm going to use volumes. So the first volume, I'm going to create it for the data name data, and there is a concept of empty directory volume in Kubernetes. When I make it as an empty directory, that directory will be made available by Kubernetes till the life cycle of the container. Okay, so if you stop the container, the data inside the directory will be lost and you will not be able to take it and attach it to another thing. So, but till the container is running, you can have the empty directory available. So I'm just going to use the empty directory. Empty dir. And next one is my config. For config, I'm going to use the ConfigMap. ConfigMap. Name of the ConfigMap is, I have already created a ConfigMap called Redis. That is the ConfigMap I'm going to use. In that, I'm going to use the item with the key, because if you see that it's stored as a, if you refer the ConfigMap, the key for this value is redis-config. So the key is redis-config, and path is redis.config, because this is the file I'm referring here. Oh, sorry, conf, not config. Redis.conf. So let me save this and let me apply this pod now. kubectl apply -f map redis.yaml. Okay, the pod is created. So now let's do the kubectl get pods. And this is my pod. There are two ways I'm going to check it. One is by executing a Redis CLI. Right? Let me execute a Redis CLI, and in the Redis CLI, let me check the config. The command is kubectl exec-it redis-cli. So this is the Redis command line. Command is g get max memory. So I have given 2 MB. So this is the 2 MB. See way can do right. Get memory. See. You can see all keys LRU. This is the value I have given in the config. This is one way. And another way is I can execute a shell and see ctl -bash. So that see the actual file. Cat slash folder thing I have given redis-master. Redis-master slash redis.conf. You can see the file.